bought this book last summer when we were starting Faith Talk TV, and I just write all over it.
Yeah, we've got lots of yellow
and I
pages turned.
That's what you corrected there.
Yeah, right.
We've been editing his book, actually.
Sorry,
Lisa.
Yeah. In the opening part, and it was talking about it's no more business as usual. And when you were talking, I was thinking, how big of a box are you putting God in? You know, as you're talking about, is God able to do big things? It's like our own vision limits what you're saying.
You know, every time I hear someone say, well, I'm just an ordinary person, I want to say, what does that mean?
Right.
Are you saying God can't work through an ordinary person? When you say, you know, I know that, you know, God's used your dad or God's used you, but like and that's you can see them defining their limits right there. You know, well, I'm just a housewife, I'm a woman, or I'm not a good public speaker, or I never went to college, or whatever it is. Right. And they just set their limits. Okay, so I'm assuming God would not use me. And I said, what does that have to do with God?
Right.
You know, here's God, infinite, all powerful, and here's you. What is the limit of what God can do with any life placed in His hand? And there isn't a limit. And
and His example of how much He's loved us is through His Son Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, if He loved us so much that He would give His Son to die for us, what else? I mean, it's limitless. Yeah. It's limitless love, limitless grace.
It's an open invitation.
Open invitation. And I think that's one thing your dad had said in the study that he did with Anne Graham, is that he always made himself available. Yeah. When God spoke to him, okay.
Yeah. And those challenging words where Jesus would say, well, be it done to you unto your faith, you know, and when he goes to Nazareth, his hometown, and then goes away, and it says he could not do very many miracles there because of their lack of belief. It wasn't that he couldn't have done miracles. He was ready to. They didn't believe, so they didn't get very much. And so I would look at my life and say, well, that looks to me like we limit what God will do in our life based on what we believe He'll do, what we're open for Him to do. And so, you know, what's our part? It's to say, God, by faith, I just want to trust you for anything that you want to do, and whatever that would look like. And it's unique to each person, but you know, what God does in my life, He won't necessarily do in your life, but that's because I'm a unique person and you're unique. But is God doing in your life all that He has in His heart to do, or is there something He's not yet done because you had some limit to say, well, I'm raising kids, you know, or I'm this, or I'm that, or whatever. And so my challenge to people is take time before God to ask, what are the limiting things I have let come into my walk with God that God just wants to just dispel from my life and just set me free for whatever the next fresh thing God wants to do in my life.
And sometimes, don't you think it's the busyness of our world that limits most of us, because we just don't take time to be with Him and even open the book.
And you know, I tell people, well, what would the next place be in your life with God? What would the next level be? And you know, don't you want to go there? And at times, I think people's first reaction is, well, in my mind, I know that would be a good thing, but I could never fit it in. You know, it's just so busy.
I'm so busy, right?
If to me, being closer with God, being used more powerfully by God, sort of implies taking more time, and I don't know if I have the time or the energy to do that. You know, and yet, you know, the reality is that being used powerfully by God is not how much you're doing. It's you might actually do less things, but have a greater impact. And that's what I've discovered is, it seems like the greater that God is working my life, it seems like in some ways, the less I'm doing, but the more broad-reaching the impact is of what I do in His strength.
We talked earlier about the joy, you know, the joy of having God in your life.
Yeah.
And Kim and I were talking about that just on the drive over, and this morning when we were praying. It's that once God starts to really fill your time, and you give time back, the joy comes. You know, there's times where we're always, I have my moment, you know, on this trip and things as we're driving.
Keeping your joy on
the
highway.
The Lord was.
But it's like, you know, God has done so much, and if we just surrendered so much more to Him, we wouldn't have the anxiety. He says, give our anxiety to Him, right? We wouldn't be quite as stressed out. So it's a wonderful invitation.
Well, you know, I've been really challenged by Psalm 16:11, where it says, in your presence is fullness of joy. And so, you know, you'd think if you were in the very presence of God, what would you be experiencing? Would it be holiness or fear or power? And you probably experience all those things, but the psalmist at that point said, but when you get right into the very presence of God, what you're going to be overwhelmed with is perfect fullness of joy. That's the air that God breathes, is perfect joy. And so in my own life, that's become a bit of a litmus test for me, and to say, if all of a sudden I'm not experiencing fullness of joy, and I know that it comes from being in God's presence, then what should that tell me?
Yeah, right.
You know, I'm not as closely walking with Him and abiding in Him as I was earlier. And He didn't go anywhere. He's in the same place. So that means I must have moved. I'm not as close to Him, and so my joy correspondingly is less now too. And so how do I get back into His presence where that fullness of joy is? And you know, that's kind of a challenge for me. As I can tell, if I want to just know spiritually how I'm doing, just check your joy out. And if your joy is waning, that ought to tell you you're also farther from God right now than you were before. You know, John 16:22 says, Jesus was saying, your joy that I give you, He was saying, no one can take it away. No one can take it away from you. So if you have lost your joy, just understand no one took it away. Nobody took it away. Because nobody can take you out of God's presence. They can take your job away. They could take your house away. They could take your health away. People could take just about anything away from you. They can't take you away from the presence of God. So I would tell people, because that's where joy comes from, if that's where you've been getting your joy from, then I can assure you, you still have joy. If you were getting your joy from the paycheck you were receiving, and now you're not getting the same paycheck, and now your joy is not there, that ought to tell you you were getting your joy from the wrong place in the first place. So I would say this is a tremendous wake-up call to say, hey, we began trusting in the wrong things. And you know, it's biblically, every time, prosperity has never brought people to God. Prosperity has never driven people to their knees saying, oh, I need God in my life.
It's taken them away,
just the opposite,
right? Because they start to trust in themselves.
You know, the Israelites over and over again, God brings them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Their farms start to prosper, their businesses start to prosper, and what do? They start turning to other things, to the God of nature, the God that blesses the rain clouds and so on. So what does God do? He brings in adversity, whether it's a drought, a famine, it's an enemy that invades the land. And then what do people do? They start crying out to God again. Oh, I got my focus wrong. I was worrying about the wrong things, and God forgive me, I want to return to you. So God blesses them again, and the cycle just goes over and over again. So in America, you know, I mean, I feel, and I've faced the crunch. I know I'm trying to sell a house for over a year.
That's right.
And I've got a lot of, a house that would have been worth a lot more money 2 years ago. Now I'm shuddering to think how little I'm going to get for it. So I mean, I'm suffering as well, like a lot of people in this economy. But I also realize that what it does is it tells you, is that where you were getting your joy from? You know, good return on your investments, security, being able to buy the little toys that we all think we need, or was that joy the very same? If you suddenly lost your house, you lost your job, and you have the same level of joy, you still walk in the door, your kids can hear the laughter, sense the joy, and they know, you know what, it's because my joy comes from the presence of God. And I've actually had more time to experience His presence since I've been unemployed than before, so it's actually getting better. I've talked to people saying, best thing that ever happened to me, I was a driven business executive. I was downsized, and all of a sudden I had time with my wife again. I got to know my kids over again. I started having extensive quiet times. I started volunteering at my church, and I've had men tell me, it's the best time of my life. I had no idea how much my life had become consumed by things that don't really matter. And it wasn't until this recession time that God helped me to get my focus back. And so my prayer is for a lot of people that, as bad as it can be and as hard as it can be on people in some ways, that it'll refine America in some ways as well.
And it's a wake-up call, isn't it? To get refocused on what really matters, and that's the relationship with God and your family, your loved ones.
And if anything else like money has become a god to you instead of the God, God has a way of just removing idols from our lives. And so for a lot of people, the number one idol has been money. And so, boy, God can eliminate that in a hurry if that's become an idol to us.